Yeah, so when I was talking to Richard about his presentation, I said there's a lot of things to be aware of and to think about when preparing for your functional automation tests. And we can just dive into the next slide. So for example, what if you don't have continuous integration? What if you don't have DevOps? Or what if they're not in your control? What can you do? So this is let's try to be prepared for the integrations that are coming. Next slide, please.
Okay.
So there's a lot of different ways that we can think about readiness. The first thing is, we have to be aware of our script inventory. We have to, make sure that we have everything prepared. We have to be environment aware. We have to have our scripts configurable. We don't want a script that's just going to run in one place. We want to have, it so that it can run anywhere and everywhere. We want to have the ability to run our tests in all the kinds of different places. And we also want to be able to report out our results so that people can see those, and systems like Jenkins, as was just pointed out, can integrate with them. Next, please. So in terms of script inventory, I highly encourage that we publish our coverage. A lot of times when you're integrating with a process, whether it's DevOps, CI, or just working with the development team to test better in earlier environments, it's good to understand what your coverage capability is. Whether you do that based on, you could go crazy and do all kinds of heat maps. You can just list what's there, but it's just setting the expectations and understanding what capability do we have. So many times, you'll see companies where a development team and a testing team are working together towards the same goals, but they're not on common ground. Having your coverage published and available for people to look at is really helpful. And keep in mind, a lot of these points and tips that I'm talking about are so that we can be CI or DevOps ready. It doesn't mean you have to have it, doesn't mean it has to be in your control, but as responsible testers, we want to make sure that, the statement I make is, as a tester, I want to make sure that as, integration with this, that, or the other thing comes forward, that we're ready for it, that we can integrate. With your script inventory, you want to make sure that you have your key features addressed. You also want to think about smaller tests. You may not want to have a large end-to-end test running that's going to take 25 minutes. Maybe you can have some smaller, simpler tests that you're going to run that are going to run quickly. When it comes to errors, we want to make sure that we're descriptive. We don't want to just say that login failed. Maybe we can provide some more detail on it, so we can say maybe why login failed, or login for what scenario failed. In the examples that Richard was showing, integrating with Jenkins, as a developer looks at a failed pipeline, or anyone, it might be useful to understand more about what didn't work. So we want to be as descriptive as possible. And I highly encourage, when building your script inventory, to build it in a way of which you're aware of which of your scripts are read-only, meaning which scripts are just which script could you run over and over again with the same piece of data and have it be successful, and which ones are record-changing. I would imagine in Richard's world with banking that a majority of his scripts do use a record, or maybe he has the ability to reset. That's one thing I never necessarily take for granted, is the ability to reset, because a lot of our environments are continuously moving forward. And I don't have the ability to say, take me back 2 days so that my data is usable again. We have to have things available for us.
Yeah, it varies very much from environment to environment in terms of the testing that's done within the bank. And it can be really difficult. Test data management is one of those things that you get all your scripts ready and you think you're ready to test, and then you've got 5 days of data prep before you can actually do proper testing. And it's one of the areas that we're starting to do a lot more automation. One of the credit card businesses that we work with has done some really clever things in terms of checking out a piece of data, so when it's in use for one functional test, it can't be used for any others. So test 47 can't trip over test 159 that happens to be running at the same time. So those types of things are something that we're working on. The other thing is you might want to run a SQL script, for example, and pull data from a test environment and then put it into your test tool. And the more things that you can do like that that are automated, the better, because managing, for developers, managing the code that they put in an environment is important, but for testers, it's the same. And if someone says, okay, we want to roll back and run the tests that we ran last week against last week's version of code, it's no good if you're just constantly overwriting your scripts. So script and test data management and version control is as important for good testing as it is for good software development.
No, I totally agree. And being CI aware is not just that our stuff is configured and running in something like Jenkins in your prior example, but that it runs well and it runs all the time. In fact, that's a great transition to our next slide, which talks about configuration. So in configuration, there are a couple of things to think about. One is your environment awareness. Your tests that you're putting forward should work just as well in all of your environments in your SDLC process. So you think about that diagram that Richard showed about, some dev environments working forward to your environments leading up to production. You need to make sure that your script can be functional in all of those. Now, based on what I said a moment ago about, I guess you'd say read-only versus transactional scripts, it is possible that some of them will only work in certain environments based on either data availability or your capability to do things in those environments. So we should be aware of what scripts are expected to work where. We want to have the environment either be something that can be built into the script and have it just know based on a thing, if that's available for you, or something that's configurable. For us, we do a lot of times via configuration. I'll show you a script in a minute, or a screenshot in a minute in ALM. Test data, as Richard was mentioning, is very important. It's something that, you need to make the decision of, is your test just going to leverage data that's in a database somewhere? It's in a data table? Or are you going to be greedy? Greedy data is the notion that, your test is just going to do some data prerequisite and build data and just continue to hog up resources in the database or wherever your data is stored. Not necessarily a bad idea, but it can also slow down your tests. Do you want to wait to do some transaction to have it be able to insert or build all the data as necessary? Or do you want to be able to run a SQL query or other type of inquiry, whether it's via an API, that preps your tests and makes it ready? Another concept that we've tossed around is having the understanding of how much data we're going to use on a daily basis and to pre-build that data every day at like midnight so that the following day it has all the necessary data available for it. There's a lot of different techniques that can be done with test data, and it's just figuring out what process do you need and what do you want to do to make that work best for you.
Yeah, it's probably worth mentioning at that point, there's another SIG talk that's probably getting on for 6 months or so old now, where we talked about using Virtual Table Server, which is this free add-on for Load Runner and Performance Center that lots of people aren't even aware of, where basically you can install Virtual Table Server. It runs as a little database. It's very lightweight, sitting on a machine wherever you install it. And you can then tell your scripts to go there for the data, so they're not reliant on their own hard-coded data or data stored in a parameter file within the script. You can update that data repository much more readily because you can do it through a browser. And it's really good for the sort of scripts which you often get in banking, for example. You might have, or you will in health as well. Someone wants a new policy, for example, from Independent Health. They're going to go through a process where they fill out an application, and then there's going to be some back-end process where someone logs in and has a look and says, yeah, I approve. And then the third step of that business process might be a customer responding to an email and logging in with their new credentials. So you've got 3 scripts there. You can't run script 2 until you've run script 1, and you can't run script 3 until you've run script 2 as well. And scripts 2 and 3 both consume data from the scripts immediately before them. So that's a very good case where you want to get some clever test data management built into your continuous testing, and that's one of the ways you can do it. But obviously, Chris was mentioning others, and I'm sure there's plenty of ways you can do it. But that's one thing that might be worth looking up if people want to look at that previous SIG talk.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and I think it just shows that there are so many different options out there, and just being aware of what the problems that you have to solve are is highly important. In terms of ALM specific things, this is a microfocus presentation, or a Vivit presentation. You know, there's ALM test lab, and there's features and capabilities that you can manage in there. You have your AOT environment variables that are set in ALM, and you have test resources tied to their test configurations. I actually have some diagrams in the next couple of slides. We can look at the first one now that will show you these things in further detail. I've obviously blocked out things that are specific to our company, but you can see that, you know, once you set up the lab manager with ALM, you have the ability to tie and build environments. Those environments have different variables and values that you can set, and you can have one central considerate repository that you can build all of your pieces from. In the next slide, I show how you can use those. So when you're going to kick off a test, you choose the environment, and the environment pulls in all the necessary values, so that whether it's a URL and a database name, a API endpoint URL, or other things that need to be pulled specific for environment, it's as easy as pulling them from this one central location. In addition, tied to Lab Manager, and this is very similar to how Jenkins can manage its nodes based on attributes, you have the ability to tag different variables, attributes, or tag the machines that you're going to run against, so that when you pull from your pool of machines, if you're looking for IE11, it pulls the appropriate machine. If you're looking for Edge, it pulls the appropriate machine. Obviously, we're not going to send a test that you want to run against Edge on a Windows 7 machine, because it would never work. You know, making sure you pull appropriate things like that. It could also be whether or not it has a particular application or access that you need. Next slide.
Okay, there's a couple of questions coming as well, Chris. I don't know whether it's appropriate to answer them, but one of them is, oh, hang on. As I was reading one question, another one came in, so there's now 3. The first one is, what coverage level have you achieved, and do you still have any manual tests left which are performed within DevOps? I suppose the answer is that you're always striving to get rid of manual tests wherever possible, particularly if they're things you have to do regularly. But it's unlikely that any organization's ever completely got rid of all manual tests. But, you know, the goal is obviously to work towards that. I can't comment for my organization because I work in a central team supporting people who are doing this, and I don't really have much visibility of what they're doing, you know, at the coalface. What do you have any comments to make on that, Chris?
I don't have specific numbers, but the 2 things I'll share is we actually look to do coverage based on priority of our tests. So we have a high level of coverage for priority 1s and priority 2s. But the other thing that we find too is, with the growing number of applications and projects that are going on, you know, specifically in healthcare with the ever-changing landscape that is out there, you know, we are, I don't want to say constantly struggling to catch up. I'll kind of flip that around and say that we're giving plenty of opportunities to stay gainfully employed. And, you know, what happens there is we are constantly building to our base and continually growing. We'll always likely have some level of manual tests, because another thing that we do is we evaluate whether or not something is a candidate for automation and whether or not it's worth the effort to build. So always be some level of manual tests, but, you know, we do strive to have a high level of coverage for our high priority and highly used tests. In addition, we've been striving to make it so that the majority of our tests are available in development region. And I think this covers another question that was asked, whereby an example of an area in healthcare. So enrollment is an area that is, really important, electronic enrollment. And I think we're at a 85% plus of our automation tests that tie to electronic enrollment are viable in nearly any environment. And as you can imagine, make for great strides in testing of patches, fixes, upgrades, and other things in development. As we're running a little short on time, I'm going to fly through the next couple slides as there's just some key points to mention, and then we can tackle the last couple questions at the end.
Okay.
So execution readiness, this is pretty simple, but just something to consider. Making sure we have enough machines available, whether they're virtual, physical, provisionable in the cloud. Those are decisions that you have to make on your own, but just thinking about, I'm going to tie into a process that's going to require me to kick off 5 tests at a time. Do I have enough availability for that? For that availability, is it okay to queue? I don't know. I can't answer that question for individuals, but we want to make sure that that's a thought that you've come up with. And in terms of readiness as well, so we've been talking about Jenkins quite a bit, but I think knowing your APIs, knowing how you can integrate with things is important. If there was this brand new server out there called Alfred, just to pick up on the whole Butler theory of things, would it be available for us to integrate with? Understanding your APIs, understanding how to remotely connect and interface with your tools, whether it's batch scripts, REST APIs, or other things, it is important. Think of it like this. I'm on a computer. Can I kick off my test with a command of some sort or a trigger? If so, you're that much closer to being ready. Next. So the final thing to mention, then we'll kind of dive into the rest of the questions, is just reports and metrics. So it's not good enough for a test to run, but we need to make sure that the appropriate information is coming back to whatever that is. Simple pass-fail is likely going to be necessary for a CI tool like Jenkins or TFS build server, or there's another popular one out there, TeamCity versus other things. But having the detailed results being able to be integrated with there, as Richard even pointed out as a demonstration, you saw the pass, but you could see that there was a full detail in there. It's quite wonderful for digging into understanding your coverage, as well as being able to understand where a failure may have occurred. Maybe you wanted to integrate with some kind of log analysis, but just knowing that you have to plan for your reports, plan for building all of those pieces is very necessary. So kind of in summary, the various levels of readiness that I wanted to have a chance to discuss is your script inventory and configuration. Very important to make sure that you know what's out there, that you know that you can run it over and over again. In your configuration, being able to tie into environments and to be aware of your test data needs, your execution capability, making sure that you know what kind of environments your tests need to run on it can indeed run, and then the results and reports that come back. I think we have a couple minutes. We can go a moment or two over. There's a couple questions that came in.
Okay.
Maybe we can tackle those quick.
Yeah, one of the questions it's in 2 parts, and so I'll tackle the second part first. But this basically says, our teams consider themselves to be agile, but most don't do their own performance testing, but turn to a central testing service to do performance testing. This obviously doesn't scale, but teams are reluctant to take on the challenges of performance testing. That's common, and interestingly, that's exactly what Micro Focus do. I was at a presentation that the head of their ADM division made recently, and he said that they've put testing into the development teams for everything apart from performance, and they still maintain a specialized, centralized performance testing team because there are some unique skills and difficulties and challenges around performance testing, and it does make sense to maintain some centralization. Having said that, it doesn't mean that people earlier in the development cycle shouldn't be using some form of performance testing. So whether that's running performance regression tests against an API using LoadRunner, for example, early in the life cycle, so that when your developers who are handing over to testers for that final formal auditable test can have some confidence that it's going to work. So there's several ways you can do it, but centralized performance testing teams are still very common, and it is a very good way of helping share knowledge between specialists within that particular field. He also asks, is there a good reference document for application delivery teams to use to get started doing their own performance testing? Sadly, I'm not really aware of one. Performance testing is one of those fields that you don't tend to just pick up and start doing. It is relatively complex. What I would recommend, rather than finding a reference document, is try and find an approachable performance tester and get them to sit down with your developers and do some quick and easy performance tests that they can learn. I mean, they're developers, they're going to know about code, they're going to know about how to get things to work and automation frameworks and all those kind of things. Try and do some knowledge transfer so that ultimately the performance testers in your organization will benefit from that, because they're not just going to be ended up with a whole load of testing to do at the end of a life cycle. They can have some confidence that developers have done things earlier. So maybe a little bit of cross-pollination would be good. And thank you, Chris. I see you've answered the question as well by saying there's a free ebook which talks about talks about this at a high level. Effective performance engineering is the thing that you should Google for, and I forgot that one of our co-directors is the author of that, so I really should have known better. I should have mentioned that.
Oh, that's fine. In fact, there was a webinar last year. I could find the link and re-promote it. If you follow me on LinkedIn, I'll try to re-promote it, where there was an individual who talked about how they managed central performance engineering and how they basically treated themselves. I mean, they were a centralized team, but how they created a process for, let's call it, managing the chaos. It wasn't chaos for them anymore because they had built a process around, handling the applications. And a very key factor that I remember from that was building known acceptance criteria for what does it take to be able to enter the pipeline of having something get performance testing, because there's an awful lot of application maturity that needs to exist before you're ready for that. It can't be let's call it a half-cocked idea that's built that says, well, we need to performance test this. Well, we need to understand what the product is doing. The level of maturity of your product definitely falls into place for performance testing, and certainly for functional testing as well.
Yeah. Okay, I think we should probably think about wrapping up, because we've got 3 questions left, so we won't take any more. But there's one where somebody asked, how many test automation engineers do we have, and how many applications are tested? I don't know the exact numbers, but we definitely have hundreds of test automation engineers at the bank, testing thousands of applications. We're a very big organization. There's around 18,000 people in the software sort of engineering and test environments and environments management people and so on. So we're a large organization, so that's obviously not going to be common for everybody. But a related question is, are our test automation engineers skilled to develop both UFT and LoadRunner type scripts? Some of them are, but that's the exception rather than the norm. And one final question is, running a performance test for a short amount of time triggered by Jenkins isn't good because it won't capture memory leaks, for example, and long-running tests. That's very true. That was a very short demo. The way I would envisage this being used for formal testing would be to run a series of tests, prove an environment's up and running, and then potentially kick off a prolonged duration test overnight. That's probably best practice. But perhaps we should have made that clear, because I don't want to give people the impression that they can do a complete performance test of their application in a few minutes.
Yeah, I think there's a distinct difference between a very small test that will let you understand the kind of feel of things versus the more fulfilling test that's going to occur later in your life cycle. I think the idea that you're trying to illustrate, Richard, is that why bother getting into that big test if the basic test doesn't work. Think of it as like a smoke test for performance.
Yeah, it's perfect for smoke tests. It's also perfect for if you've got something that isn't a complex business process, like testing an API or web service, something like that. You know, you can hit an API with 5,000 requests in a few minutes. That's a valid test to see how an API might respond, particularly if you're doing kind of regression testing to make sure that changes that you've made haven't degraded the performance of a particular API or service. So thank you for stopping and asking questions, because we're getting to the stage where we're running out of time. Appreciate those of you who are still on the call. I'll just tell you now briefly about a few other events that Vivit's involved in. One of the things that we didn't talk about in this presentation was security testing, but again, that's something that can be automated. You can use Fortify, for example, under Jenkins control. There are plugins specifically for security testing, for example. So if you're interested in security testing, or you know people who are, they may be interested to hear of the Cybersecurity Summit, which is happening in Washington, D.C. Towards the end of September. If you are interested in that, please register using the link that comes in the Vivit email. We're keen to demonstrate to Micro Focus how Vivit members are interested and engaged in attending these types of events. We've also got a few webinars coming up. I'll tell you a little about those. One of them is tomorrow. So if Chris and I haven't bored you with webinars and you fancy another one, there's one related to software QA tomorrow, talking about value stream integration and how it can improve QA. We've got one coming up in August talking about cloud integration, so OpenStack Cloud and integration with SUSE Linux. And then the final one to mention is around total view analytics within ALM. So that's in September. The other thing that you'll get after this email, as well as an email of thanks saying thank you for attending, is a request to complete a survey. It would be great to get your feedback around this SIG talk. You can let us know what we did well, what we did badly. And if you're interested in talking or sharing some of your experiences, which we would definitely encourage, please complete that survey that will also be in the email that goes out to you. It's great for people to share experiences, and that's something that we're looking to encourage within Vivit. So thank you once again for attending, and I think that wraps it up. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Yeah, thank you. Goodbye.